Have you ever asked yourself the question, can you wake up if you don't fall asleep? And what does that question really mean? Well, this week we'll attempt to find out by examining Asteroid City, the latest surreal Type 2 film from Wes Anderson. Understanding is useful, so here we go. I'm Carl King, and this is The Carl King Show, where every week, almost, we learn about music, filmmaking, and creativity. If you like this show, head over to patreon.com/Carl King and join for just $1 or $5 per month. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. Special thank you to my illusionist $51 level patrons, Hank Howard III, Sean Motley, and Chubode. Quick shout out to my music endorsements, Vienna Symphonic Library, Fractal Audio, Ernie Ball Strings, Toontrack, and Millennia Media. Now, let's get this episode beginned. Very good friends of Carl King, we've got just a couple of Carl King the Human updates, and then we will officially get beginned. Number one, some of you might have noticed that I've skipped a week here and there in my episode release schedule, and that's because there have been many logistical things to be dealt with. I've been moving gear around, disconnecting things, connecting things, disconnecting things again, all with the muscular assistance of Mike Stone. And I'm hoping to get this show back on the regular weekly schedule soon. Number two, last week I did release a pilot episode of a sort of radio show I've always wanted to make called Sounds Like Noise, where we explore harmonic and rhythmic dissonance with a focus on 20th century classical music and beyond. I love that type of noisy orchestral music, and I included some of my favorites by Varese, Steve Vai, Christopher Rouse, Michael Daugherty, Frank Zappa, Jerry Goldsmith, Bernard Herrmann, and others. And you can listen to that first episode on Mixcloud, and I will put a link to it in the show notes. And now, on to this week's analytical filmmaking analysis of the week. This week's analytical filmmaking analysis of the week is Asteroid City, directed by Wes Anderson, and also righted by Wes Anderson and Roman Coppola. By the way, Roman Coppola.
It's Coppola.
Also co-writed previous Wes Anderson films. Darjeeling Limited, Moonrise Kingdom, Isle of Dogs, and The French Dispatch. And the musical score in this one, with a descending major third motif, is provided by Alexandre Desplat. And this is what I refer to as a Type 2 film. If you don't know that terminology from previous episodes, go and check out episode 57 called Are There Two Types of Art? In my own totally subjective opinion, I love Wes Anderson's films, and I don't care at all about the complaints about his movies being all the same. I see it as his own style, which I enjoy, and I honestly can't get enough of. Wes Anderson himself has acknowledged that he has no intention to change his filmmaking isms because those are simply his tastes, and they are my tastes too. So we get his trademark Type 2 rhythmic timing and the structure of the scenes, the ironic reversals, the witty dialogue turns, the interruptions, and the super complicated blocking and precise camera moves. I saw Asteroid City at Landmark Theater's Sunset in Hollywood, and it was a special event in which the entire theater was remodeled in the style of the film. All the attendees were given Junior Stargazer t-shirts, but I do not know where mine went. When the lights went down and the film began, I was captivated from the first moment. I felt total awe and delight. And as it went on, there was so much happening in this film. There's no way I could write or say anything useful about it after watching it only once. To achieve some level of useful understanding, I prefer to watch films at home with subtitles and constant pausing. I like to rewind and look closely at the details of shots and notice the lengths of scenes. It takes me probably 6 hours just to go through a single 90-minute film and take notes and write an analysis, especially with a Wes Anderson film. And his shots are designed like complex paintings with multiple layers of story happening in the foreground and the background. So I recommend that you do what I do. Inspect all of that detail because there is more than you can ever experience, even in multiple viewings. Now, on to scene 1. Viewers of this show might know I always take special notice of 2 things about a film. Number 1, how long is the first scene? And number 2, when is the first line of dialogue spoken? So let's find those things out. After the film studio logos, which runs for about 1 minute, the actual first scene is set at the fictitious WXYZ TV Channel 8, a 1950s retro television studio. The concept is this. We are about to view a televised production of a theatrical play. So that's 2 levels of hyper-reality so far. A theatrical play, but broadcast on TV, and we will come back to that. So far, everything is in black and white, and there's a host standing on the stage. He is played by Bryan Cranston, and he introduces the play that's about to be broadcast on 1950s TV. So he stands there and gives a monologue. And that's where a single person speaks at length. Not dialogue, but monologue. But here's the thing about monologues in films. They can be boring. We expect film to be largely a visual art with humans interacting with each other, relating through conflict. One person talking at a camera like I'm doing is not that. So it's difficult to keep a monologue interesting without including some visual activity or visual changes. And that's exactly what Wes Anderson gives us in this scene. Not only visual changes, but audio changes. Bryan Cranston doesn't simply stand there and speak. He steps to different points on the stage, speaking into various microphones, seemingly for no reason other than to make this monologue scene more dynamic. But here's something unusual. At times, he steps away from the microphone and continues speaking, which changes the character of his audio signal, meaning lots of natural reverb from the room. If this were a real TV broadcast, that would be a serious issue. The camera cuts are unexpected, and they show him from multiple extreme angles. And props are revealed, and there's even an overhead shot. It's basically a lesson in all the ways you can make a stiff and serious monologue entertaining. And this entire scene is that 3-minute monologue, which is an impressive feat. And at the end of this monologue, something wild happens. The play begins, but it's not a play. We experience it as a live-action film, as if we have entered so deeply into the fantasy that it becomes real or hyper-real. And the opening credits begin. Now, in those opening credits, in contrast to the old 1950s black and white TV look, we launch into saturated film colors, much like when Dorothy opens the door to Oz. And here's where something else unusual happens. The technical crew credits scroll by on the screen like they did in the old days, because in modern movies, only the major credits, like the main actors and directors and producers, the big names, are listed in the opening credits. And that's probably in the hopes that the audience sticks with it. Everyone else, like the best boy and gaffer, goes way at the end as everyone's leaving the theater or changing the TV channel. But with Wes Anderson's retro sensibilities, those technical credits appear way up front near the beginning of the film. And again, this is not a new thing. It's actually a very old thing that isn't done anymore, or at least very often. As all of those credits are presented, we are following a train carrying supplies across the desert. And there's a comedic pattern in the order of the items shown on the train cars. There are grapefruits and avocados, the usual stuff. But the final item we see is a 10 megaton nuclear missile that has the words printed on it, "Caution, do not detonate without presidential approval." Now, why a nuclear missile would be sitting out in the open on a train car going across the desert, I don't know, but it's funny. These live action shots are surreal and do resemble a stage play, because the mountains in the background look like theater flats or 2D models of landscape like you'd see on a ride at Disney. And they are, in fact, scale models of mountains and cacti or cactuses. And those opening credits run for about a minute to the song "Last Train to San Fernando," performed by Johnny Duncan and Bluegrass Boys. When the song ends, the train sort of drops us off, and we get a quiet look or establishing shot around at the small town of Asteroid City, which is not quite a city. It's a car repair shop, a diner, and a motel, and a touristy asteroid crater. And for those who have been to the desert, it actually reminds me of two inspiring places I visited years ago. The Little Alien in Rachel, Nevada, near Area 51, and also the Meteor Crater in Arizona. The camera rotates around Wes Anderson style, locking down on 6 different shots. Number 1, train tracks. Number 2, diner. Number 3, motel. Number 4, a ramp that is indefinitely closed. It actually leads to nothing out in the middle of the desert. Number 5, a gas service station. And number 6, the regional monument, the Arid Plains meteorite. And it occurred to me that it locks down in these 6 different angles, and that might relate to a certain 6-sided object that will be referenced later. And what I love about it is that this quiet, rotating, establishing shot scene is almost totally silent, perfectly capturing the essence of a small desert town. And it goes on for 1 minute, 20 seconds, and that's plenty of breathing room. And then Act 1 begins. We have what could be an inciting incident, but that inciting incident actually happened off camera. We meet our main characters, a family in a station wagon being towed into the service station, and it is through their point of view that the story is told. They are what critics of Wes Anderson would call quirky characters. For instance, the son writes in a little book, and the dad snaps photos with an old camera, but no dialogue is spoken for a full minute until the dad leads them into the diner and says 5 orders of flapjacks and a black coffee. And they sit and chat, and we find out how intellectual that family is. The 3 little twin girls are obsessed with witchy goth stuff. The waitress asks them what they would like, And one says she's a vampire, another is a mummy in Egypt who got buried alive and came back to life with its head chopped off, and the third enthusiastically just says, I'm a fairy. And throughout the film, you'll also notice Wes Anderson uses a lot of text on things, like little signs. And you could possibly watch this entire film and only pay attention to those signs instead of what's happening in the foreground. For instance, the family station wagon, if you look closely, has a little sign on the door that says French Press International Wire Service Photo Agency, which must be the name of the family business. After breakfast, the family goes outside to speak with the mechanic, played by Matt Dillon, and he says their station wagon has one of two problems. And to diagnose the problem, he puts the car up on a lift and attaches a tiny little twisty tool part. And all seems well, but then the engine explodes itself and all of the wheels go flat. A robotic piece falls out and wiggles around like it's alive. And the dad says, confused, "What's that?" And Matt Dillon just answers, "I don't know." A living robotic part of the car falls off and wiggles around, and somehow the mechanic doesn't even know what it is. So it sparks and sputters, and all he can think to do is spray it with a water hose. And the scene ends, as Matt Dillon says, "I think you've got a third problem we've never seen before." Up next, we get what I think is the second most amusing dialogue scene in the film. The dad, Jason Schwartzman, calls his father-in-law from a payphone booth, and his father-in-law is played by Tom Hanks with a mustache. Tom Hanks' assistant answers the phone and goes to fetch Tom Hanks. While Jason Schwartzman is waiting for him to get back to the phone, some cops and robbers drive by on the main street of Asteroid City, shooting at each other. And no one in the town is concerned about getting hit by a stray bullet. The people of the town simply pause and watch. And this happens several times in the film. The same thing happens with nuclear weapons being tested in the distance. The characters in that town show no reaction or fear, and it's a funny way to break up the scene. Anderson used this same trick in another film, The Grand Budapest Hotel, when Jude Law and F. Murray Abraham are in the steam baths. There's a pause in their conversation, and we hear a guy shouting in pain somewhere in the same cavernous room, and it cuts to a shot of an obese man's naked rear end getting hosed off with water. And I have no understanding of why that is happening, but it is a great comedic moment that divides the conversation. Back to Asteroid City, there's a long pause in the phone conversation, and Tom Hanks asks, "How'd they take it?" And this is brilliant dialogue writing because it is realistic. The two people are having a conversation about something only they know about, and the audience hasn't been brought into it yet. Tom Hanks says, "You didn't tell them still?" And Jason Schwartzman replies, "I didn't tell them." Now, as viewers, we don't know who hasn't been told or what they haven't been told. This dialogue scene is also skillfully written because there are many awkward pauses. These are unspoken emotional moments between two people, even over the phone. At this point, I noticed, this is a quiet film. Since the intro credits, I don't think there's been any score music, and we are already 11 minutes, 48 seconds in. The phone conversation continues. Tom Hanks, the father-in-law, asks, "Are you okay?" And in Wes Anderson style, Jason Schwartzman calmly answers, "No." And there's another long pause as the two men stare at each other, split screen, across the phone line. Jason Schwartzman asks, "You never liked me, did you?" And Tom Hanks replies, "I never loved you." "You never thought I was good enough for her." And Tom Hanks says, "Yes, we're saying the same thing." And they kind of overlap in their responses. Then, more visitors arrive to Asteroid City for an astronomy convention, all at the same time. It's a bus full of kids and many cars. Now, what is the purpose of this scene? Well, it's a convenient way to introduce all the new characters all in a row. In the diner, there's sort of a CIA dude sitting there pretending to read a newspaper with dark sunglasses and an earpiece. And that's sort of a fun detail, and I think he also shows up in the background of a few other scenes. Steve Carell plays the motel manager, and he seems to begin every response with, "Of course, I understand." And it's funny that he acknowledges his guests' complaints in such a cheerful way, yet does nothing about them. And in the next scene, we find out what is up with our family of main characters. It turns out that Jason Schwartzman hasn't told his 4 kids that their mom died 3 weeks ago, but now he does. And he's sitting there with her ashes in a Tupperware container. And the kids aren't shocked. And the scene ends with a question. He asks them, "If you could have anything in the world to eat right now, what would it be?" And it simply cuts away. That's the scene button. At 18 minutes 48 seconds, we cut back to the 1950s black and white TV studio. There is an abrupt and oddly framed shot of the narrator, Bryan Cranston. It is a close-up, but he's small and low in the frame. And you rarely see a close-up frame like that with so much space around it, because obviously the point of a close-up is to actually be a close-up, not far away. And this is where the story gets an additional level of multi-layered complexity, because Jason Schwartzman is now playing another character, which I think is supposed to be the actor behind the character in the play/film that we were just watching. So this is supposed to be the real world, but it's actually shown as a stage play. He and Edward Norton, the writer of the play, have a conversation, and then he abruptly walks out a side door on the stage, then immediately back in, dressed as the dad from the colorized Asteroid City timeline, but he doesn't have that same bald shaved spot on his head. And he says, "It's a fact. We're not alone. The aliens stole the asteroid." And I think that this is sort of a cubist filmmaking style. Maybe Wes Anderson is telling the story from a different angle. And I think it's a monologue to his son. So he's acting out a scene from the color film. And then it's back to the full color universe of Asteroid City, where everyone is gathered inside the asteroid crater for an event called Asteroid Day 1955. A general gives a speech, and here's something fun. There's a redundant sentence structure in the speech patterns in this film. For example, the general says, "But first, I'll give my speech first." Later, Tilda Swinton as Dr. Hickenlooper says, "I never had children. Sometimes I wonder if I wish I should have." That's some unusual language, and it is easy to miss. Anyway, the general is very formal, and he breaks his speech up into chapters. And for each chapter, he switches microphones for different positions on the stage, the same way that the host, Bryan Cranston, did. For chapter 2, his assistant, that same sort of bellboy assistant character from Grand Budapest Hotel, also played by Tony Revolori, runs up and pulls a mic out of the stage and runs back. Then for chapter 3, the general steps completely away from the mic, but his audio signal doesn't change at all, meaning being on or off mic doesn't affect the sound of his voice. So those mics aren't actually doing anything. And after chapter 3, he does a second chapter 3. And later, Tilda Swinton, as that character, Dr. Hickenlooper, does the same stage motion as the general, moving between the mics for some reason. Now, I'm about to spoil the film, so I alert you to either stop listening or keep listening. But in a very important scene, when they are gathered to witness the astronomic event, a 6-sided flying saucer descends, which might be related to that 6-sided camera angle motion earlier in the film. And I simply want to point this out. The part that comes out of the hatch looks very much like that same tiny piece that the mechanic attached to the bottom of their car. But it wasn't identical, so I'm wondering if it was actually intentional. The scene ends with a button, spoken exposition. In case somehow you weren't watching the most bizarre scene of the film, Jason Schwartzman says, the alien stole the asteroid. But as I was watching this, I was thinking back to science class. It's not technically an asteroid if it landed on Earth, is it? Since there are meteors, meteoroids, and meteorites, all depending on their interaction with Earth. So does that also apply to asteroids? Would they be asterites? After this alien encounter, the town is quarantined. The military locks it down. No one can go in or out. And that doesn't seem to affect much because they're out in the middle of the desert anyway. Now, possibly my favorite thing about this film is the relationship that develops between Jason Schwartzman and Scarlett Johansson. They have robotic, seemingly emotionless conversations. My favorite scene is when they chat through the windows of their adjacent cabins. And she says deeply philosophical things about what their lives mean, and he just listens along, trying to light his pipe over and over, and grunts, uh-huh. And when Scarlett Johansson does her brief nude scene using a body double, Jason Schwartzman says, sometimes they do a stunt double, and there's that redundancy thing again. And she interjects, I don't know if I like beards, by the way, which is a non sequitur in the middle of a conversation. It had nothing to do with what they were talking about. And it's a Wes Anderson trademark, that overlapping of conversation and rapid switching of subjects. And the acting might come across as flat, but there is a lot of subtlety. It's just not a big, superficial melodrama. These are eccentric, super intellectual, cerebral characters. As the film progresses, reality continues to disintegrate. Characters occasionally move between the play and the film, and things go wrong, and actors actually miss their cues. There's a non sequitur moment where Bryan Cranston, the host from the black and white world, steps into a shot in the color world and interrupts a scene, and the two other characters turn to him confused, and he pauses and says, am I not in this? And he scoots slowly off the screen, embarrassed and mumbling, excuse me, I'm not in this. And there's sort of a climax around an hour and 28 minutes, a major scene where the flying saucer comes back and returns the meteorite back into the crater. The general announces that the lifting of the quarantine has now been canceled, and at that moment, all hell breaks loose. The crowd goes into a panic because apparently they don't want to be quarantined again. During this madness, there's a close-up on Jason Schwartzman, and he says, why does Augie burn his hand on the quickie griddle? And he turns to Scarlett Johansson and says, I still don't understand the play. And he walks past her, and she seems confused and asks, what? As everyone is going insane and screaming and fighting, Jason Schwartzman opens a hidden door in the wall of the crater and walks off the set of the film to backstage and into the black and white world. And he goes to the director, Adrian Brody, and asks what the meaning of the play is. And it's a surreal moment because all this time we've been watching the story as a film, but the film connects to the real world, and it is, for the first time, revealed to be a play. Jason Schwartzman says to Adrian Brody, I still don't understand the play. And Adrian Brody says, doesn't matter. Just keep telling the story. And this could be a moment of reflection about life. We don't know what the meaning of it is. We just keep playing our character. Schwartzman then takes a break and walks out onto a balcony and encounters Margot Robbie, who previously appears in the photograph of his character's wife, who died earlier in the story, or before the story began. And he says, oh, it's you, the wife who played my actress. And that's a surprising twist because it would typically be the actress who played my wife. Now, it's pretty clear to me that this film has no Type 1 plot, because it's not a video game. There are no clear, tangible goals. It's all about theme and style. But at the end of this Type 2 film, all of the characters seem to let go of their anxieties, finding a sense of peace and acceptance. And it has gotten better every time I've watched it. Since I can't wait to see what Wes Anderson makes next, I gave this film 5 out of 5 stars and a little heart on Letterboxd. Okay, that's the end of this episode of The Carl King Show. Remember to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or anywhere else you consume these dang episodes. And if you like this show, support the creation of more episodes by joining my Patreon for $1 or $5 a month. That's patreon.com/Carl King. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. Thank you to my little production team, my script editor Chris Higgins, and my transcriptionist Eric Alexander Moore. My Patreon patrons help me to also pay those guys. And a special thank you to my $51 a month patrons at the special illusionist level, Chubode, Sean Motley, and Hank Howard III. And thank you to all of the very good friends of Carl King for joining me. And as I always say,